Imagine being a Canadian citizen. You wake up one morning, whip up breakfast, and turn on the news. Instead of seeing the local news, you are immediately met with footage of US troops stationed along the Canadian border. Donald Trump is ready to follow through on his promise of making Canada the 51st state? Sounds ridiculous, right? Well, the Trump administration might just be crazy enough to do this.
What I'd like to see, Canada become our 51st state.
Today, we look at how the United States can do this, and if it is even possible.
America's neighbors to the north are hopping on the MAGA train. I've heard they call themselves Maple MAGAs. Some Canadians jumping at President-elect Trump's offer of huge tax cuts if they become the 51st state.
After finishing your breakfast and pouring that second cup of coffee, you might be asking yourself, will the US take Canada by force and upend millions of people, or will they destroy Canada with economic sanctions? Well, the first mention of this started back in 2024. Under the first Trump administration, the commander-in-chief posted on Truth Social, "No one can answer why we subsidize Canada to the tune of over $100 million per year. Makes no sense." Many Canadians want Canada to become the 51st state. They would save massively on taxes and military protection. I think it's a great idea. 51st state. But looking at Trump's history on Truth Social, you might just blow this off as another ridiculous rant. But this time, it might be different. Perhaps the US president is following through on one of his idle threats this time. Then, just a few months before taking office, Trump again floated the idea of making Canada the 51st state. This time, he directly referred to the Canadian Prime Minister as Governor Trudeau.
Look, I called him Governor Trudeau because they should be the 51st state, really. It would make a great state, and the people of Canada like it.
The comment reaffirmed what everyone was fearing. Perhaps the United States will follow through this time and make Canada its next state. The only question is how. Will the United States apply military pressure, or are economic sanctions the best course of action? Let's have a look at both. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe to our channel for all the latest content. The last thing the world needs now is another war. Not only have we seen what happened in Ukraine and Israel, but history has not been kind to countries on the receiving end of these wars. But if negotiations and even threats don't work, the Trump administration might need to resort to military intervention. Now, the United States-Canada border is over 5,000 miles long. This makes it the longest border in the world. But what is interesting is exactly how the border looks. On a map, you can see it broken up into various sections. Starting in the north, Canada borders the US state of Alaska, which will become pivotal should it turn into an actual war with boots on the ground. However, the largest section is in the south. This line stretches from Washington state all the way across the continent to the New England state of Maine. It covers numerous states with ready-made military infrastructure like the Malmstrom Air Force Base located in Montana, the Grand Forks Air Force Base in North Dakota, and the Joint Base Lewis McChord in Washington state. This creates a big threat to Canada, but it also makes it a lot easier for the Army to ready its troops for such an offensive. Up north in Alaska, we find the Elmendorf Air Force Base and Fort Richardson. These two bases essentially mean that Canada will be surrounded from the start. A two-pronged invasion, starting from the south and then followed by entry from the north, could quickly lead to the fall of British Columbia, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. But Canada is sure to put up some resistance. In fact, in the early history of these two countries, numerous squabbles already took place. Most notable is the 1775 invasion of Quebec, when the United States quickly took over Montreal. However, President Washington ordered US forces to flank around the side and encircle Quebec a little farther north. The plan was a grave mistake, as forces needed to march across more than 400 miles of freezing frontier land. By the time US forces reached Quebec, more than half of Washington's forces succumbed to the elements or deserted. A contingent of British forces would later arrive in Quebec, ultimately repelling the attack and sending forces back to the United States. A few years later, in 1812, the United States and Canada again fought a war over Canadian territory. This time, it was due to British soldiers trying to imprison U.S. soldiers on its ship. Again, the United States failed to make any meaningful gains, and through a combination of British forces and the elements, the U.S. retreated. Many believe this to have been the decisive battle between these nations, with all disputes being settled and Canada earning its right to be a sovereign state. Ultimately, the United States and Canada would become allies, with two world wars sealing this relationship, and later both became critical partners of NATO, which would have a lot of ramifications should the United States attempt to take Canada by force. Under Article 5 of the NATO agreement, an attack on one is an attack on all. Such a move would have major ramifications that would spill over into Europe. In layman's terms, the United States will incur the wrath of its NATO allies across the pond, including two nuclear superpowers in the United Kingdom and France. However, the United States has successfully taken land throughout its history, especially on the North American continent. Back in 1847, the United States bought a large contingent of land from Mexico, adding a few new states to the country. These states include Arizona, Colorado, California, Kansas, Nevada, New Mexico, and Utah. It all formed part of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and cost the United States only $15 million. This is around $577 million when adjusted for inflation today. With the Californian GDP being $3.9 trillion in 2023, it was quite a bargain, even when inflation adjusted. But in 1930, the United States concocted what would be known as War Plan Red. This was a unique yet detailed plan of how the United States would go about invading Canada if need be. Unlike the earlier two-pronged assault we discussed, this one is a little more detailed and relies on three angles of attack. The United States would stick with a land-based invasion, which will be supplemented by air. However, naval blockades will render the Canadian Navy useless and possibly lead to encirclement. The naval blockade along the shores of Halifax would be critical, essentially blocking any European support from arriving to supplement a Canadian defense. Similar strategies will likely play out in Vancouver. Inside the United States, various troops would begin their march from Albany, New York, with the hopes of occupying Montreal, and another contingent from Detroit would focus on taking Toronto. Now, this plan was designed in 1930, and with modern technology and military capabilities, it does seem rather ridiculous to modern scholars. However, it shows that the United States does at least have a plan, should it come to a full-scale invasion. Moreover, Trump also has a large military advantage. The United States military is by far the strongest and largest in the world. Meanwhile, the Canadian military only ranks 28th according to Global Firepower, or GFP for short. In terms of pure numbers, the United States has a manpower of more than 150 million, with 125 million being fit for the military. This largely outnumbers Canada at just 16.68 million and 13.5 million fit for military purposes. In terms of the current active military, the U.S. has a force of 1.32 million and another almost 800,000 in reserve. Meanwhile, Canada only has about 68,000 troops, with half of that in reserve. But it is perhaps military equipment that makes the biggest difference. The U.S. has more than 13,000 aircraft compared to the 351 of Canada, 4,640 tanks, and more than 390,000 armored vehicles. Canada can only use about 74 tanks and over 21,000 armored vehicles. So, in terms of an outright war, Canada will undoubtedly succumb to the pure might of the United States military. But as alluded to earlier, there is a major problem, and that is NATO. Article 5 of the NATO agreement will be a major barrier for the United States, even if President Trump chooses to withdraw from the treaty. Should Trump proceed with an invasion, it is worth nothing that NATO, which consists of about 30 other countries, will still have a combined total of 1.5 million troops and various other forms of military equipment. Essentially, they would stack up well against the United States. But it would bring great chaos to the world, so Trump would much rather choose to rely on economic pressure. But what does this look like? If the United States chooses to pursue further economic pressure on Canada, it could work. But it would take various punitive measures, including Trump's favorite word, tariffs. We have seen the implications of U.S. tariffs on countries like Russia, North Korea, and even China in recent history. Many of these punitive measures have absolutely destroyed economies, with Russia currently facing inflation of close to 10% and an interest rate of 21% as of March 2025. These measures work well when enforced by the global community, but Canada's allies will certainly not abide by these sanctions and create a lifeline for the Canadian economy. A country like France, which has the second largest military in Europe and the seventh largest economy in the world, could be pivotal in ensuring decent support for Canada. Furthermore, Canada has already proven that it can retaliate when the United States applies tariffs. On March 13, 2025, Canada enacted 25% tariffs on almost $30 billion worth of U.S. goods, seriously harming the U.S. economy, especially in manufacturing and mineral exports. These have already affected the United States, with citizens having to dock up more for products they used to buy at more affordable prices. We have already made an in-depth video covering exactly how these tariffs are affecting the average U.S. citizen that will be linked in the description. But let's say that the United States successfully managed to annex Canada. What would such a country look like? First of all, analysts have found that Democrats would benefit significantly. In fact, Canada would likely be a blue state, and this will significantly increase support for Democrats heading to the polls, a move President Trump might not want, judging by how close the election was. Politico suggests that Canada would get 2 senators. In Congress, Canada would likely get around 45 seats, just one fewer than California, and about 31 other states would each lose a few seats if the House maintains only 435 seats. While this doesn't spell any problem for the citizens, it does significantly change elections. Based on the general voting history of the 50 states, Democrats will enter with 253 seats compared to the 202 of the Republicans. This means that 85 seats will be up for grabs in battleground states. To achieve a majority of 271 votes means the Democrats only need about 18 seats to seal victory. As you can see, the addition of Canada as the 51st state would largely disrupt the Republicans, and the Democrat Party could rule the House, Senate, and White House for the foreseeable future. Does this mean Donald Trump is merely making idle threats? Well, perhaps this is just another strongman push to intimidate the Great White North. No one truly believes that the United States will pull the trigger on this. But what do you think? Is it possible, or even worth it for the United States to annex Canada? Let us know in the comments below and make sure to subscribe to our channel for more of this content.